Hello, my favorite listener. This is Engine of War, Episode 5. Must be Tuesday. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a Rust Belt Studio production. We have the two other shows. The spiritual cousin to this show, Mikey and the Garden Arch, which also runs on Tuesdays, as well as then Into the Dark of the Woods. A folklore-heavy, kind of not too scary, twisty scary, I suppose, stories. Those run on Fridays. Those are all set in northern Michigan. Now, settle in. The show is about to start. A young Sparker's work was never done. As soon as Kael had finished at the mine and had borne witness to the parting of another bot on the veer, he was hurried back to Copperspire and, after reporting, back to work. The carts came 2 by 2, wheels iron-shod and ringing like stubborn church music on the stones. Men with bandaged heads stared at the ceiling like it held maps. Men with sleeves pinned to shoulders kept their chins tight because if they let them go slack, they would begin to shake. Men who smelled like smoke and electricity sat very still so nothing inside them would fall out. Orderlies ran, with lanterns lifted, steadied, and swore in the soft workmanlike way that made swearing an act of mercy. Docents stalked like black-wrapped metronomes setting tempo. Cuts 3 through 9, lungs, 12 through 16 limbs, keep the scent light, we have much to do. They had burned out years ago, and that made their voices pure math. They could not spend, they merely counted. Kael shouldered through with his bench kit already open, lens arm loosened, coil polished by habit. The smell reached him first, even before the blood, the guild's own weather, riding in the backs of boys who hadn't meant to catch it. Ozone, ash, and rain. He took the first cut at the head of the line because there was no other honest way to do it. A man lay there with his uniform open to the ribs. The fabric burned and a flower petal patterned around a wound that was not a cut, but more of a burn. Skin at the edges had been seared in a lacework as if a lightning strike had tried to learn how to sew. "Shock lance," the orderly said without looking up, making it a category, not an accusation. "Sabers aren't enough, we're using the bot's controls against people now." Kael set his palm. The man's heart bruised the inside of his ribs with a fast, foolish tempo. The burn was the worst kind. Half-dead skin lying to the live about what it needed, live skin believing it. He centered his hands on the copper cradle, breathed once, and let the smallest of himself unspool through the lens. Ozone. Ash. Rain. Not too much, not at a burn's edge. He teased the skin away from the air of sealing too fast. He taught it to choose clean first and then close. The man hissed and clutched the cot rail with the strength of a man lifting his own house. Kael kept the line hair thin and broke spark before he broke touch. When he stepped back, the wound no longer tried to be pretty. It was simple, honest, red and pink, and honest wounds heal. On to the next. Docent Malin was already there when Kael looked up, as if a man who could not spend had learned to be in 2 places to make up for it. Doing well, keep your scent light. He added the last not because Kael had gone heavy, but because he had to say something. Yes, Docent? Duran wasn't on the floor, and Kael noticed the absence like a silence under the bell. The other young Sparkers were there, Bren with his careful jaw, and Evo with his hands that shook until he touched copper and then went still as a mortician's. They worked clean and fast because war didn't wait for men to make an art of it. Kael took a kid next, barely a beard, face peppered with stippled black where powder had bit, left leg split like a branch in a storm. The boy watched Kael's hands like they were a stage trick. "Are you one of the saints?" No. Just breathe. What's it smell like? The boy asked because pain makes some men poets and some men fools. Everyone keeps saying it has a smell like ozone, ash, and rain. Kael leaned in and drew. The bone learned, and the boy went white and then green and then the color of a man who has decided to live out of spite. Kael eased back, set the leg straight, wrapped it in a linen that had seen too many stories told at once. A professor stood 3 cots down, hands behind his back like a man listening to music he refused to tap his foot to. Professor Thane, white hair like fillings caught in static, eyes that made boys forget lies they hadn't told yet. His presence made the air hold itself differently. He did not speak, he watched. When he moved, it was to shift himself closer to a heel cot, not closer to Kael. He had made a life out of refusing to be caught staring at the thing he cared about most. Kael kept moving. A soldier with a jaw fractured and wired shut, he smoothed the line where bone decided to reinduce itself to bone, and then set someone to remove the wires. A woman who had been near a cart when it died, splinters embedded in her flank like punctuation. He coaxed them out with patience and the kind of spark draw that made the air taste like ozone at the back of his tongue. Field medic, an orderly said over his shoulder, jerking his head toward a man on a low pallet, eyes closed, breath ragged. Burned himself thin, thought he could pour for 6 in a row and not pay the ledger. The docents want you to take a look. Kael crouched. The man had the look all sparkers feared seeing in a mirror, the brightness gone, not dim, but sideways. He smelled like the absence of rain, dry and brittle, the air after a storm that forgot to fall. Kael put his hands to the man's sternum, not to give and not to take, just to listen. A sparker's center is not a thing you can mend like a break. You do not pour spark into a man whose jar is cracked and expect it to hold. You teach the walls to remember themselves. He drew the line inside himself first, small, careful, and held it close until his chest acknowledged it and settled into it. Then, with the barest brush of his fingertips on bone, he offered that rhythm the way you offer a lullaby to a crying infant. Not so much a fix, but a reminder. Ozone, ash, rain. The man's breath caught, then evened. His lashes fluttered, and he looked up with the astonished gratitude of a man who had been sure he was still falling. You pulled me. No. You stopped. I only reminded you how. It's the same thing. Light hand. The professor's voice came over Kael's shoulder now. Do you always remember to let go when the work wants to keep you? Not always, Professor. Thane smiled. Men who say always are liars. Men who say never are dead. Then he moved on, which was the most mercy he gave to the hall that day. Kael stood and nearly stumbled over a roomer that limped in on 2 legs and a pair of hands that looked like they'd been kissed by angry bees. The soldier they belonged to was young, eyes too big, smile wrong. He sat himself on the cot edge, flinched at the sheet like it was hot, and whispered, It turned on us. What turned on you? The swelling had the look of a current's bite, shock rods maybe, but not quite the same. The cannon. So we'd braced her, we lined her, we were ready to send meat downrange, and she turned. Not at us, just away from the men. Kael cleaned the punctures, smoothed the irritated flesh with the barest of draws, the kind you can almost convince yourself is breathing, not spending. Ozone, ash, rain. Docent Malin appeared with a ledger he had no intention of writing in. He had come not to scold and not to count. Cannons are not autonomy. Your cannon did not turn, you failed it. Machines do not turn. They break, and we replace them. They say the saw at 14 turned. The saw at 14 veered. Malin said that harshly, daring anyone to raise any other word in his hearing. No one did. Kael took a breath and found the bottom of his chest. He moved to the next cot, a man there with an eye bandaged tight, and the purple-yellow map of a head wound sinking its fist into his temple. Kael eased the swelling not by pushing too much, but by coaxing blood back along the proper lanes. He kept the scent light, he kept his shoulders low, he kept his tongue still when men told stories he wanted to argue with, and docents told rules he wanted to believe. The work made time spare little of itself, and he looked up and parts of the day had burned away like fog when someone opens a door and lets the weather in. A bell tolled noon, and someone put bread in his hand and a cup of broth in the other. He ate standing at the end of a bench and watched Duran stride in at last, hair damp, robe collar open like he'd been run behind a cart and wanted the room to know it. Where do you need a miracle? Malin did not look impressed. Hands, and mind your draw. Duran grinned and nodded and then proceeded to ignore half of that advice. He took a crushed hand and poured a little too bright. He took another and almost made a show of closing his eyes to feel the music of it. Men with pain in their heads do not care if the song is in tune. The air thickened, and for a moment around Duran's bench, Kael could smell it, even across the row. The heavy version of the refrain, ozone, ash, rain. Another docent called from across the room, Rule 4! Someone somewhere blushed, but it wasn't Duran. Kael finished a chest with 2 ribs caged wrong and a lung trying to decide if it was a pond. He put breath back on a path where it could find the rest of itself. He broke spark before he broke touch. When he stepped back and the world did not sway, he felt a kind of victory the hall never writes down. Word came in from the corridor that led down to the boiler rooms the bellows bank had stuttered again. A small old problem that liked to dress up as a new one when the day was already busy. Kael felt it in his shoulders like an itch he refused to scratch. He did not go. Mechanics took their tools. They were going to have to sew that iron without him today. You holding up all right, boy? An orderly asked as he passed, seeing something in Kael's face he didn't know how to name. I'm holding. The war kept coming. A pair of men supporting a third whose calf had been removed by something that did not ask permission. Kael couldn't give men back parts that was no map for. He could only make the wound true so it would not rot out of spite. He shaped the stump to fit a future, not to pretend at a past. He sealed a vein with a thought, and he listened to arteries till they agreed to the new borders of the nation under the skin. He took another boy whose eyes didn't line up anymore and taught one of them to stop trying to look at yesterday all the time. He took a man who had been near the wrong side of a shock lance and drew out the angry chew marks left by current and asked the skin to be skin again, not a wire. Ozone. Ash. Rain. The Hall of Mercy sleeps badly on nights when carts come in from the front. It snores and pipes and mutters and rafters, a building that dreams in steam. After midnight, the nave quieted to the slow breath of men trying not to make noise with pain. Orders thinned to murmurs. The docent's footfall softened from metronome to metrical ghost. A house porter clicked past with folded linen, one green eye half shaded as if even its lens knew to squint at grief. Kael waited until the last bell in the courtyard clipped the hour, then slid from his cot and went the long way so habit wouldn't catch him. The workshop alcoves lay off a side passage once used for baptisms and now used for repairs. The old stone still remembered water. He had claimed the narrowest room, a bench, a shelf, a single oil lamp whose glass had been smudged by 1,000 thumbs. He closed the door, set the latch, and lowered the lamp wick until the light became just barely a hush. He set his healer's kit on the bench because he couldn't not: copper cradle, lens arm, small glass reservoir for calming draw, the tools the guild recognized as hands. Beside them, wrapped in plain linen and tied with a frayed cord, laid the thing the guild did not recognize at all. He unwrapped it without ceremony because ceremony made lies of things by giving them altars. The device wasn't much to look at: a short copper tube, 2 nested lenses he'd borrowed from a dead cradle and not returned, a coil wire to a release ring he'd taken off a cracked valve and polished smooth with his thumb. No stock, no weight for bracing, not a cannon, a flute, a question, a sin made of scrap. None of those words were right, and all of them were at the same time. He palmed the tube. Cold settled against his skin. He felt as he always did when he laid hand to it, the way his chest answered not a tug, not yet, but attention. Sparks left light when there was copper in the room. He breathed once, and the room breathed with him. He sized the distance to a chunk of slate he'd set on the far shelf and leaned a battered nail against it at a slant. He had chosen slate because it didn't splinter. It admitted damage without lying about it, and that felt like a kind of mercy even now. Only a taste. He told himself this because saying it made it more likely to be true. He set his left palm along the tube, found the place where the metal and bone made a circuit, laid his right thumb on the ring. He did not touch the healer's lenses. He didn't need to. The narrowness would be his own. He drew. Ozone. Ash. Rain. Not enough to fog the room, never that. A thread that could have been mistaken for a thought if thoughts left sense. The coil hummed against his palm, and the tube pricked cold to the heel of his hand, and across the alcove the slate nicked with the smallest pop of stone adjusting itself to a new idea. The nail quivered, then leaned a degree farther from pride. A hairline line drew itself across the slate's face like someone had written "careful" in a shard of chalk. Kael let the ring slide back. He broke spark before he broke touch. The ache behind his sternum answered, present, proportionate, a ledger entry, not a loan shark. He closed his eyes and matched breath to ache until both agreed to be reasonable. Outside in the corridor, boots slid on stone and a voice pitched low said, "South. I tell you, past the wilds and the uncharted, they gather there." Another voice, older, tired. "Machines don't gather. Men put them there." "Whatever. Tell that to the ones that looked at me as they walked by." The city of bots. Kael had been hearing scraps about that all day with the blood and the bandages, south past the old river where the maps start to guess. A place with no steeples, just chimneys, no bells, just whistles. A city with lenses for eyes. A soldier had laughed about it, the way boys laugh when they've seen something that scared them and want to make it smaller. Kael opened his eyes. The slate with its thin wound felt like an argument he was having with himself. He lifted the tube again, angled it a breath higher. He could have stopped. He should have stopped. He didn't. A second pulse, slightly larger, meaner, like a cough a man hides in a handkerchief. Ozone. Ash. Rain. The nail snapped, one clean, sullen sound, and the state flinched and held. Kael dropped his hand from the ring so fast the copper bit his skin. The ache flared hot in his chest, and he had to brace his palm on the bench and remember not to teach the ache to be worse by staring at it. He counted backwards in his head, 5 breaths, 10 gave the ache a number to hold to instead of a story, and when it settled, he laughed once without humor. His little device had more appetite than his caution liked, and the part of him that measured depth knew he would always be tempted to pay a little over workman's rates. He wrapped the tube in linen, then unwrapped it again. He did that twice, a ritual people call safety when they are wrapping and unwrapping guilt. He set the tube down beside the healer's kit, and he looked at both tools like they were brothers who refused to admit they had the same father. The lamp made a shallow glow on the reservoir's curve, and he slid a thumb along the glass. Men had been reminding him all day that the spark was finite. Men had handed him the sentence like it was wisdom and warning and permission slip all at the same time. Finite meant measure. Measure meant mercy lived in counting, but there was another word that went with it. Rechargeable. The docents always said the second word with less love, since they no longer charged. How much is left when you bend it to breaking? Kael asked the room, not expecting an answer and not really wanting one. He picked the wrap tube up again, thoughtful now, not hungry. He unwrapped it, not to use, but he adjusted the inner lens with the edge of his nail. The ring loosed itself enough to breathe when he pressed, and he felt the familiar give. He marked the coil's wire with a scratch so faint he'd have to find it with skin tomorrow. He was as much a mechanic as the guild would allow a healer to be, more than they would like. He liked that about himself. The pipes overhead ticked as the boilers shifted in their sleep, and the house porter made its soft, two-step walk past the door again and paused. Kael held still until the pause passed, until the mechanical footfalls went on to fold towels for men who decided at dawn whether they were ready to keep living. He thought of the ore hauler with the green lens at mine 16 saying in a voice like rusted chain, "I have life. I am not a pickaxe. Even the oxen are treated better." The words unfurled again in his head with a stubbornness very much like the machine's own. The lens had found him before it died. The saw carriage had found him at the timber camp. These were not coincidences you put in a drawer. Giver. He had heard the word that a wildling had called him under his breath as if it were predicting weather. Kael told the whispered he was not, and maybe he wasn't yet. Maybe he meant he wouldn't be, maybe he didn't know. The uncertainty sat on the edge between the healer's kit and the copper tube like a third tool, sharp on every edge. He set a clay brick on the floor and drew a chalk line across its face. He didn't know why the line made the test feel cleaner. A mark gives you permission to say you hit the mark. He unwrapped his device again. He was fueled by the anger. He knelt, breathed in as if he were laying hands on a man's broken wrist, and the smallest pulse he could manage, the spark narrowed to a filament that felt like the edge of a long word on his tongue. Ozone. Ash. Rain. The chalk line didn't so much break as forget itself, a gap appearing where the agreement had been, and the brick chipped a whisper off of its corner. The pulse came back into him in a heartbeat later, as if a useful thought had decided it belonged inside a skull again. That was new. The return. And he registered it with a careful attention men reserve for weather and wives. He lowered the tube. He had spent enough, more than enough, for a night that had also earlier held at least a dozen men's breath in his hands. He had not burned, but the border that keeps prudence from pride felt narrow as a thread. He wiped the tube, the lenses, the coil, his own hands, and then he wrapped the device and tied it off. He did it with the same care he'd given to wrapping a wound. He put the bundle back in his pouch, along with his healer's kit. He sat, he let his back find the stone, and he listened. The hall had its list of nightly noises, a cot creak, a swallow in a throat, a docent's quiet cough. Tonight, new notes had added themselves. Soldiers' songs that he didn't know, small pieces of rumor that had looked for miles to reproduce them in the south, the city of bots, machines that stepped out of their lines and stayed out. Kael splayed his hands on his knees and studied them like they belonged to a man he might be asked to trust. They were not large hands, they were competent, a little raw at the knuckles, a little stained at the nails. They could hold a man in one piece long enough for hope to arrive. They could point a line of spark along a tube and take a corner off a brick. They could lay a palm on iron and teach it how to breathe smoother. They could, one day, if the word giver had not been ridiculous when it had been landed on him, lay that same palm on a machine's chest and feel the glow there answer like a small sun. He had not felt it yet. He had been close, and he had not allowed closeness to carry himself away. He was, after all, a careful boy. Careful boys live longer. Sometimes they live long enough to become dangerous men. Kael looked down at the 2 different tools he had tucked into his pouch. 2 futures honed to points he could cut himself on without even lifting them. He did not like thinking in forks and roads. The world had never given him straight lines long enough to get used to them, but choices arrive the way weather does, and you either name them or pretend you are dry and rain. Ozone, ash, rain. The smell lived in the room like a reminder he'd left the lamp go too high, though the wick was nearly out. He lowered it anyway, pinched it with wet fingers, and let the dark have the workshop. In the corridor, the house porter's careful steps came and went. Beyond that, the city breathed through its wall, gears in the gate chewing their dreams. Farther still, past the brick line where maps turned rumor, something he could not hear arranged itself into a rhythm that had nothing to do with the bells. When he stepped back into the hall, a boy in a soldier's coat too big for him was asleep on a pallet with his hands curled as if he still held a rope. Kael stepped past on the balls of his feet, soft as a thief, and then smiled at himself because he had stolen nothing except another day to think about things. He did not sleep quickly. He lay on his cot and watched the ceiling invent patterns out of cracks. Weapon or mercy, he asked the dark, and the dark had the honesty to say nothing. The bell for the 3rd hour touched the air like a question asking permission. The answer came from farther away, more felt than heard, a second bell, not a bell. Something flanged and mechanical that carried a long, low note toward the city and shut itself before the wall. He closed his eyes, and he opened them again. He pressed a palm to the sternum and felt the day's draw echo there, small and obedient. He promised himself he would keep it that way. He promised himself nothing else at all. Hello again. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Engine of War. It was written and performed by Brian Foster and is a Rust Belt Studio production. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and we see you, JP. All go a long way to helping the studio move forward and continue to grow. If you'd like to do more, you can always join our Patreon, and the link is in the show notes below. Starting at just $2, you'll get early and ad-free access to all the shows that we do. Thank you very much, and until next time, my favorite listener.